In the case of animals, the sex organs are ovary and testis. But what about the plants? Can they reproduce sexually? Yes, of course they can. And we know the part which is concerned for reproduction is the flower. How many parts are there in a flower? When we talk of flower, we usually talk of its most brightly colored part, the petals. But is a flower only petals? No. Just like life is not only the colorful part, flowers also have many other parts which may not be as glamorous but are very significant. The parts of a flower are sepals, which are generally green, and they protect the flower in bud form, because when bud is there, the other parts are not fully developed. They need protection. Just like when you were small children, you needed more protection. So you were kept at home, you were taken more care. But now that you are a little more independent, you come out. Similarly, when the flower is in its bud form, it needs more protection. So it is the sepals which cover it. That is why you must have seen bud is generally green in color. It is not the entire bud, only the sepals. Their number can vary. It can be 5 or the multiple of 5. In some cases it is even 4. In some very few flowers, what we find is that sepals can also be colorful, but that is rare. The second part is petals, which of course are large, showy, colorful. Why so? Because they have a very important function of attracting insects. So that is why they are large and showy, and they are much larger than the sepals, because they have to be shown, and they are very many colors, right, ranging from blue, green, not green, blue, red, orange, white, so purple, so many colors are there. Inside the petals there are stamens. If when you pluck a flower and if you just happen to touch it casually, sometimes on your finger yellow powder comes. What is that? The pollens. Where are the pollens? In the stamens. A stamen has two parts. It has a thread like structure, the filament, and the bilobed anther. Inside the anther there are pollens. The pollens contain the male gamete. So we can say anthers are the male reproductive organ. The fourth part is the carpel. It is also called pistil. This has three parts: a bilobed structure at the tip, a long tubular structure connecting the tip with the base, which is rounded and swollen, right. So this tip is called stigma, tubular structure is called style, and this is called ovary, the female reproductive organ. Inside there is ovule. We can also draw the diagram of a flower. A flower has a stalk called pedicel. It ends in a disc-like structure called thalamus. On this are arranged sepals, petals, the stamens, on thalamus are arranged sepals, petal, carpel, and stamen. So what is this? We don't see flower like this. because actually there is a complete whirl, a circle of petals and sepals inside our stamens and carpel. Then how we are able to see it here? Because this is a LS, the longitudinal section. We have cut the flower longitudinally to see the parts. So, these are the parts of a flower. Now, if the pollen grains fall on the stigma, this will be called transfer of pollen grains, and the one word that we use for it is pollination. However, this is not that always happens. Sometimes, especially in case of unisexual flowers, now this is another story. What are unisexual and bisexual flowers? Unisexual flowers are the ones which have only one sex organ, either the stamen or the carpel, and the bisexual flowers have both. Example of unisexual are papaya or watermelon, and the example of bisexual flower are many, like rose, hibiscus and so on. Now, in a bisexual, there is a possibility that the pollen grains can fall like this. But what about unisexual? There either there is stamen or carpel, that means it has to fall on another flower. But this happens even in the case of bisexual flowers. So, which means pollination is of two types, self and cross. In self, it is within the same flower, and in cross, the pollen grains fall on the stigma of another flower. But how does that happen? It needs to have some medium. So, wind, water, insects and even small birds like hummingbird help in cross pollination. From pollination, we will move to the next part, which is the actual union of male and female gamete. So, in the case of cross pollination, the pollen grains fall on the stigma of another flower. It could be of same plant or another plant, and obviously some transportation is involved in it. So, the agencies for cross pollination are wind, and what about aquatic plants? Water, insects and even birds. You know, the smallest bird, the hummingbird, is able to perform cross pollination when it sucks nectar. So, this is how the pollen grains fall on the stigma. Now, what happens after that? When we were doing the hormones, I told you about chemotropism. So, the chemicals are produced from the ovary, because of which the pollen grains develop a pollen tube. Now, here is the pollen grain and this develops a pollen tube. That will enter the ovule. This is the pollen tube. Interestingly, the pollen grain does not have only one male gamete. There are two. If we see the structure of ovule, it has 8 cells. This is the ova. These are the polar nuclei. So, one gamete combines with the polar nucleus and other with the ova. So, the union is of two male gametes. So, that is why in flowers or in the flowering plants, the fertilization is called double fertilization. The polar nuclei will form endosperm and the ova after fertilization will form zygote, which will form an embryo. embryo within the ovule. Now, after the fertilization has taken place, many changes appear. Now, you know the role of sepal, petal, stamen, style and stigma is over. They no longer have any role. So, they fall off. Their role is over. What is left is only the ovary and the ovule. So, ovary rapidly divides and it becomes thick, swollen, stores food, and what it becomes is a fruit. Ovary changes into a fruit and the ovule changes into a seed, which develops a thick coat, seed coat, once again for protection. Now, seeds have many advantages, you know. The seed can remain like seed for many years. You know, that is how we store our grains, wheat, rice, pulses, because if they are kept in dry conditions, they can remain like that for many years. But the moment you put them in soil and water, optimum temperature, minerals and oxygen, all these things are available to them, they start germinating. What happens when they germinate? A small thread-like structure comes out of them. Now, if we split open the seed, it is like this, and what we find is a thread-like structure grows out of it, which is called radicle. This is the future root. Another thread-like structure grows towards the light, and this is plumule, and this is the future stem. So, this is this growing of radicle and plumule, and finally a seedling from a seed is called germination of seeds. And that is how the new plant comes. The food is stored within the seed. So, initially when the plant is very small, it does not have leaves, it cannot make its own food, then it draws food from the seed leaves. Just like you people, just like human beings, when children are small, they get their food from their parents, especially the mother. But as they become more and more self-sufficient, then they are on their own. Same is the story of seeds. When the seedlings are small, they derive food from that is stored in the seed leaves, and when they develop their own leaves, then they can perform photosynthesis, and so they live independently. This is how a plant, a flowering plant, can reproduce sexually. So, that is about sexual reproduction in plants.